Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making Marketing Accountable, episode number 12. My name is Frank Finley. I'm the executive director of MASB, and I will be your host today. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Peter Cain. Peter is the executive director and co-founder of Marketscience, an independent marketing analytics consultancy. He has more than 20 years of commercial and academic experience in economics, marketing science, and designing econometric business solutions. He previously was in academia, specializing in monetary economics and econometrics, and he has published in top peer-reviewed journals and continues to do so. He is widely known for championing the use of dynamic modeling techniques to capture long-term brand effects that provide a complete measure of ROI. So with that introduction, Peter, welcome.
Thanks, Frank. Cheers. Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. As Frank says, my name is Peter Cain. I run a company called Marketscience, and I used to be in academia, and I left about 25 years ago to do various routines around IRI, Nielsen, Millward Brown, those types of outfits. And I started this company with a couple of colleagues a while back. One of the main things we've been trying to do is provide academic underpinnings for a lot of what goes on in marketing analytics. And we kind of pride ourselves on being one of the few, or probably the only company, which publishes in peer-reviewed journals and pretty much exposes what we do quite openly in papers. And with that in mind, there's a couple of key issues I wanted to talk about today and the challenges and pitfalls. So with that in mind, I wanted to provide some overall context about what marketing attribution is. And I'm sure most folks know this, but I wanted to kind of level set. Then I wanted to sort of drill into what the modern marketing mix modeling structure typically looks like, with some examples of key outputs. And then I wanted to drill into the meat, which is, I guess, the main discussion point today, which is the key challenges and pitfalls that we see in mixed modeling typically today. I guess in a nutshell, marketing attribution models are pretty much designed to quantify, as the name would suggest, the sales or revenue impact of each marketing tactic. It doesn't have to be sales. It could be binary decisions like did I not go to a website? Whatever the kind of key outcome is, it's designed to try and understand the role of marketing alongside many other touch points in that journey. I think we all know that, over the years, we've had mixed modeling going back 30, 40, 50 years when it kind of started in FMCG with P&G and Unilever and those folks, where they were trying to understand and use econometrics to understand price and promotion predominantly with offline media. Of course, with the digital revolution, X number of years ago, we've had a burgeoning in, the ability or the desire to mix online marketing investments with offline. Part of that thread has been this multi-touch attribution type idea, which is about, and I'll go into a bit of detail on what that would look like, but ultimately it's about purely online focus to say, look, I've got, let's say, 3 weeks worth of data. I've got, I don't know, 300,000 cookies, which I've recorded. And I want to understand the journey across those 3 weeks of each of those individual ID markers, if you like, and how they move through a journey exposed at each step to different types of marketing activity. Problem is, as we've seen nowadays, privacy concerns with the reluctance to reveal individual cookie information, an increasing inability, if you like, to obtain consistent user identifiers as people hop across platforms, and tracking people is quite difficult, and people switch on and off cookies and third-party cookies and so on. But equally importantly to that, there was this need to combine off and online media into one system, which it was difficult to do with MTA because it was very much micro, very granular focused, whereas macro type decisions like broad reach media don't sit well with that granular structure. So how do we combine them, right? So that's a kind of another thread. There are people who try and create unified structures. I think today I just wanted to focus on, out of that, MMM structures, more aggregated structures which get around these privacy concerns have had to evolve to capture more complex consumer behavior. And how have they done that? And what are the pitfalls? Now, part of that journey or offering has been as I'm sure everyone knows, lots of open source offerings through Robin, Meridian, PYMC, all these types of of offerings to the market to say this is how we can semi-automate or clarify or conveyor belt, if you like, the mixed modeling process. Um, but the problem, which I'll come to in a bit more detail as we go through, is there are two key elements to this, which I think are a bit swept under the carpet and essentially not well identified or not well defined. First is what long-term measurement. So what does it mean when we talk about long-term effects of marketing? That's very rarely identified. It's very rarely defined. And I'll talk a bit about that. And then the other key problem is this kind of concept of causal inference, and everyone's talking about it these days. It's AKA incrementality, right? Everyone's talking about it. And it's come to the fore again, because I guess folks have realized that when you have observational data, you have problems around believing what you see. And is it really what we think it is? And that's what we call this identification problem. So with that in mind, let me just give a broad overview of what a simplified attribution journey could look like. So we typically start off with often online paid media. That, and again, this is not exhaustive, this is just a snapshot. Typical suspects would be things like TV, print, radio, outdoor, PR and sponsorship, social media, paid search, display, email, affiliate, as just a snapshot. Okay. Then you have this online interest and click-through. So you'd have organic brand search impressions, brand paid clicks, display clicks, email clicks. A lot of that would then click through, if you like, or comprise the website. So people will click through to a website by various sources. So they'll see a brand search paid link and they click through to a website. They'll either go to the website homepage, they can go to a landing page, and social media can play a part in this. Because what I'm trying to delineate here is, I think, what we've probably heard of before, this paid, owned, earned type structure that's been common in the past. We have paid media, owned media, and you have earned media, and how they all play together, right? And then you have a final outcome. And the final outcome in this instance could be sales. How much revenue did I generate on the left-hand side going through a system like this through various pathways, right? And then what's of key interest, I think, in these structures is when we set up a system like this, where does offline media sit in that? How does that drive online media? You know, similarly, how do these things link together? So typical thing would be TV could drive a branded search, and then branded search could then lead you to a site, and it could do other things. But it's almost like a step-by-step touch point journey, which we're trying to model, and it can get hideously complicated, right? I mean, the econometrics is plagued with dimensionality issues. Everything depends on everything else. How do you kind of what simplifications or assumptions does one need to make to try and get a reasonable model of what's going on, right? So with that in mind, all of this comes together to try and understand the effect on the left-hand side on the right-hand side, out of which then comes basically marketing ROI, really, and all the other stuff that comes with it, which is budget allocation, forecasting, that kind of thing. Okay, so with that broad structure in mind, I wanted to kind of drill down to a very top line macro view, if you like, of what a mixed model structure would look like. And I'm going to do that in two parts. The first part on the left is a simplification of the previous slide where we're saying, okay, you've got a whole bunch of stuff on the left-hand side. You've got some kind of network in the middle, which in this case is just a 3 touch point network. Could be much more complicated than that. I'm just trying to illustrate a point really, which is inputs go in the left-hand side through a kind of network system, which I think people would probably call a DAG, like a directed acyclical graph, where you kind of you try to understand the causal chain through the system. And the key word is causal there, but I'll come back to that in a moment. People can be a bit loose with that word. But anyway, so a key idea these things are called nested econometric models. Everyone does it. All the agencies do it. It stemmed from this POEM system, this paid owned earned media system that people talked about probably about 10 years ago now. It's a variation of that. So these things called nested econometric models. So here, for example, you'd have a model for an actual online search in terms of the left-hand side. You'd have a model for web traffic, which is a function of the variables plus online search as a kind of funnel, like a journey. And then similarly, brand sales could be a function of both. And then you have to kind of identify, and I'll come to what that means in a minute. But you then have to say, okay, how do these things and these touch points drive these? So how do these marketing mechanics drive these touch points, these stepping stones, if you like? How do they interact with each other? And indeed, what are the indirect and direct effects of the left-hand side on sales, directly and indirectly? How does seasonality, distribution, and competition act as controls in all that? The thing I would say before I go on to the later material is this is predominantly designed to handle last click attribution problems. So we have a load of stuff about how we attribute. Do we do last click? Do we do first touch? Do we do averages in terms of how we understand the effect of each individual touch point, or if you like, marketing lever on each of these points? How do you allocate these things along the journey? Well, this is a kind of fairly simple example, which says, okay, if I have TV, which then says, okay, that drives search, and then that drives web traffic, and then that drives sales. The TV can work directly or indirectly through online activity, for example. But that's trying to deal with the last click. It's like a total football analogy, I guess, right? It's not just the TV or let's say paid search, for example. It's not just paid search which drives a sale because TV did something to drive paid search at the beginning of the funnel, which means it needs to be credited for its role in that journey. And that's really all this is about, right? But that's what I would call the economic model, which one sets up. And that's what we work with clients to say, okay, what do we believe that microcosm, that journey looks like? And then you have to say, okay, the next decision process is to say, what level do you want to do this at? And that's where the right-hand side comes in. I don't think any sane modeler these days would do a model of the total US in one single equation, even a 3-equation system like that. They would more than likely do it at DMA level. The idea being that it's unlikely that TV is going to have the same response in every DMA, every marketing area of the States, even every region. It'll differ. So typically you need to go down or drill down into, I think about it as a hierarchy. You say, okay, total US level, you may drill down into four regions, then you may drill down into states, you may drill down to DMAs, consumer cohorts, cities, whatever it be, whatever data are available, it's that kind of hierarchy of understanding how decisions, which may be regional, but also could be broad reach macro, but how they differ, those effects by individual groupings across the country. Because that obviously helps for more accurate modeling, then helps with more targeted media strategy. Because you can then, a part of your media plan, you could say you could upweight in Boston versus LA or whatever. Right? It's that kind of thing. Okay. And again, none of this is new. This is done by most boutiques, this type of thing. What do you get out of it? Now, this is just a passing slide, but I wanted to spend a couple of seconds pointing out that none of this is a done deal either. So, and what I mean by that is the way marketing mix is sold these days, typically, particularly on places like LinkedIn and other fora, or other forum, I guess, is, and this is also the open source arguments. You can take a piece of kit and you could put the data in one, like a sausage machine, whatever, crank a handle and get all these wonderful, wonderful outputs out the other side. I just wanted to kind of take stock there and say, well, there are various problems with this, i.e., first of all, putting aside the parameter estimation. And what I mean by that is all this stuff here is trying to understand what is the response of sales to one of these levers. What is the elasticity? What is the marginal response to it? Those are called, I guess, parameters, right? As understanding the model structure and the parameters is just one thing. The problem, well, not problem as such, but another decision point is I've got all this stuff. How do I convert all these models into some usable output for a client? Because clients don't typically care about what the elasticity is. They want to understand what do I do, right? And that's when these things come in. But this is by no means a done deal. What I mean by that is, let's say you have a log-log model. So log sales is a function of log stuff on the other side. It's a multiplicative. Everything interacts with each other. It's not additive. So how do I take that model and decompose it into an additive form, which I can then deliver to a client to say, okay, I can break up your sales into component parts. That will be done differently by most agencies. So you may get a different answer, whoever you talk to. Point being is ROI in itself is not a unique quantity. It doesn't have to be a unique quantity. So there's the devil's in the detail in a sense. Similarly for response curves, that will be done differently by everyone. People will take a different functional form. Typically they're concave, but they assume the shape. Most people do. I do. We assume a shape because we believe the principle of diminishing returns exists. No one typically estimates it from the data, as in take the data and estimate what the response curve shape is. They'll assume a shape, a concave shape, or maybe an S shape, and then they'll parameterize it by saying, okay, what's my slope? What's my maximum uplift? That kind of thing, which is fine, but it's just a lot more to it because it's quite touchy-feely how you do it, because it can depend on scale issues. You need to think about what the maximum points of spend are per market. It's a bit more woolly, really. But that said, when those are calculated, this is what I call the $1 million pie chart, because this is what clients want. They want to say, right, I've done all this stuff. How do I allocate my budget between all my levers compared to what I did and my optimal result? And that optimal result would then say for a fixed budget of 10 million quid or dollars, how do I optimally allocate my levers to maximize my bang for the buck? That's really what we're doing. And that will involve many factors, such as, do I do it where I constrain myself to my historical laydown? Do I want to advise on what the model says about optimal laydown over time? All that kind of stuff. And then on the back of all that, you can do forecasts, right? So that's the kind of meat of, where marketing mix modeling is at the moment, really. So with that in mind, I'm hoping I'm not racing through it too much, but that kind of sets kind of a marker in the sand of what mixed modeling is kind of all about, right? And I'm forgive me if I'm kind of preaching to people who know all this stuff. So what is wrong, apart from the stuff I've just outlined, which is, the touchy-feely elements of what is classically done? What I wanted to get a handle on now is two issues. One is long-term and one is causality. Causality is very hard, and people who say they've solved it, when they say they've solved this, I just say something, well, I look forward to news of your Nobel Prize then. So no one's solved it per se, but there are many different areas we'll focus on in a second, people trying to deal with it. The first thing, which is difficult, I think, but a little less esoteric, is this thing called long-term. So when we think of an equation, a standard model, we think of best fit lines at school, right? That's really all this is. It's just a glorification of the same thing, but we do it in networks. So we'll say things like, okay, sales is a function of some kind of base plus stuff, TV, net, search, whatever it is. What we're trying to get at is, how do we deal with both the short and the long-term elements of, let's say, TV? So when you build a mixed model and you say sales is a function of base plus TV, there are two ways of thinking about that long-term effect of TV. The first is what I think probably most people know as an ad stock, which is just simply saying, well, you advertise today and it has decay effects, what econometrician will call lag effects. So you could either say sales is a function of TV today, TV T-1, T-2, T-3, and test which lags are important. Or you could just simplify it all by putting an ad stock in. That's all an ad stock is. It is just a constrained lag function, which is constrained to decay exponentially to asymptotically towards zero. That's all it is. And then you say, okay, well, how long is that? How stretched is that structure? Is it short, like 10% is eradicated per week? Or is very quick, as in very quick, sorry, I'll turn it around. Is it very quick, as in 90% eradicated, or a 10% retention, whichever way you want to look at it? Or is it very long? Is it 90% retained, okay, each week? So it builds. So when you do that type of structure, you can mimic growth curves, basically. And that's what leads to these types of long-term effects. So when people talk about long-term, we have to ask the question, do you mean a total effect with an ad stock, which just accumulates something over time and says your full effects are materializing in 10 weeks? but the base is still fixed? Or do you mean something which builds the base and is genuinely brand building? It would be a very strange brand building if we looked at our sales and we saw they were completely flat. Sure, brand building may be there because you could just be investing to stand still. But if you see a net growth relative to competitors, there must be a reason for that beyond macro growth, for example. And that's the key of what I call genuine brand building modeling, which is about not what's my total effect around a fixed baseline, but how do I understand and measure how media can drive short-term call to action, but it can also drive growth in the base, i.e., it can drive brand building, and we can understand how it's doing that. So that's what I mean about long term. We need to define what we mean by it, and it can mean very different things, really. So the problem with the mixed model, I mean, it's less so now. I'm a bit hoist by my own petard with this stuff because I've been doing this UCM kind of baseline modeling for 25 years now, and I think a lot of people are doing it, which is great. So what I'm saying here is most mixed models, have fixed baselines, may be less true now, which is great, but you can't stop at that. Just by allowing the base to grow and change as part of the mix and test whether it's growing, it's just one part of the story. The next part is to say, well, I now need to understand why it's growing, if it is, and how, what's driving it. And that's where the holistic measurement process kicks in. Because you first of all need to measure long-term persistent base evolution if it exists. And then you need to understand whether marketing drives it. And then that gives you an estimate of the dynamics of how marketing builds brands, really. Okay. So what does all that mean in network parlance? Well, everything I've just said is really about splitting short and long-term modeling into two distinct parts, which are linked. And bearing in mind, this is just stuff I've developed and published on. It's just a model. I'm not saying this is the definitive truth because I don't think it's just modeling, right? I'm just saying here is a more, rather than just sticking metrics in the model and hoping for the best, here like ad stocks and high retention ad stocks and calling it long term. Here is a more intuitively realistic, if you like, or plausible way of thinking about how short and long term effects work. So you have a short term network, which is what we talked about before, which is, again, a very simplified flow where marketing can affect, and there's a reason I put it left to right, which I'll come to in a minute. But you have all the usual suspects here driving our short term network. And that works, and I'll come to the exact specification in a second, but that works through what we call an unobserved component model. So what it'll do is it will just model this type of journey, but it will allow for this evolving baseline here, everything I've just talked about in the previous slide. So it's trying to build a short-term network to separate out the short-term call to action, if you like. And what I mean by that is they're just temporary. Those are marketing actions which simply bring folks in. They may not necessarily stay, and the baseline, they're kind of orthogonal to or on top of the baseline, right? The baseline is doing its own thing, those things. So an ad stock could be part of that. You can imagine a TV coming in, brings folks in, the full effect wears out maybe after 3 weeks, but it doesn't change the baseline as such. There's no brand building per se. Okay, so that's that bubble, right? The long-term network is then trying to capitalize on the long-term part that we've modeled. And so we've got the short-term part here. I've now got an estimate of my baseline. I'm now going to build a separate but linked network, which is solely focusing on the trends. And I think that's the key, is whenever we talk about brand building, observable brand building, that is, because don't forget, brand building could still be there. You just can't see it if the data are flat. And that's a perennial problem with modeling. Just because it's flat doesn't mean it's no brand building. You could just be maintaining a share, which, then one would ask, what do you do? What do you do? There's no variation in time to model. So this is the key. Then you may try other approaches, but when it comes to time series approaches, variation through time, what we're interested in here is modeling trends, because that's what we observe as brand building. And the question then becomes, how do you model trends? And that's why you need a different approach to the mixed model, because mixed models are pretty much the stationary data. Stationary data means it doesn't really evolve with variance. It just looks fairly flat and it doesn't really evolve much. As soon as it evolves, as in the data, the sales data has some kind of discernible drift, discernible growth evolution to it, then we're in a different type of mixed modeling because we're talking about modeling trends. And the reason that's important is the whole correlation causation. It's not really a segue, but it's related because we all know the idea that rainfall in the Amazonian forest can correlate with, I don't know, pig herder births or whatever it is in a different country, and they just happen to trend together. We've always seen that example, and they're totally unrelated. They just trend together. When we're modeling trends, we need to avoid that spurious correlation type problem, and that's why we need to think about different ways of modeling when we talk about modeling trends, which is what the long-term network's all about. So what does that mean? Well, I'm just going to quick headline here to say this is what the basic structure would look like. This is a standard unobserved component model structure. And all it means is if you read that as a regression line, y is equal to mx plus c, there's your c, your intercept, there's your mx, as in x, and your m, which is the classical marginal response. So this is just a standard, what one would call a best fit line, really, where you have things like a baseline, a season, pricing, all the usual suspect variables, right? Plus some macro growth factors. But what you're then doing is you're generalizing it to say, well, I'm now going to model a baseline in tandem with these things. So everything I've just talked about in terms of short and long-term split. And you can have a model for that. You can have a model for the growth. Is there any trend growth in it? Or is it just the intercepts jumping up and down in this random way to deliver what looks like growth? But does that growth then have a drift to it? Is there a seasonal pattern? Does that seasonal pattern change? And it delivers something like this, which you have typical model, where you've got the data bombing around, and then it may grow, maybe have a slight drift here, maybe grow here. That could be a distribution effect. You control for all that. And then you end up with a trend line, and you have a seasonal pattern, and then you have random errors. And you want these random errors to be as white noise and as stationary as possible, because then you can then interpret these coefficients with reasonable precision. So what happens then? Well, you then take this and say, right, now I've cleaned all the variation here, all the short-term variation. This now enters into what I call a long-term network. Now, you've probably heard of things like structured equation models, path modeling. It's just a variation of that. What I mean by variation of that is path modeling is typically static, i.e., you would say variable y is a function of variable x, and then maybe variable x is a function of something else, but there's no dynamics to it. It's just static modeling, and you're just interested in coefficients. And that's a problem because you need to understand of how you get from A to B. You need to understand why the base grows. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So I'm saying a very simple structure would be the baseline, where the base is a function of itself, last period. I've just done lags of 1 here. There could be more. But you're trying to build a network between base and basically consumer metrics, basically. And so what you're basically saying is if the base changes and evolves and moves in a trending evolutionary type way, the first step to say is the reason that's doing that is potentially due to changing, evolving consumer perceptions. So it'd be a very strange evolving baseline controlling for all this Z activity. This is kind of economic growth, right? The last thing you want to do is misattribute. So you need to understand if base is growing due to distribution or macro growth, you need to control for it, because these are the effects we want to focus on. We want to say, okay, my base is growing because there is a relationship between the baseline, just as an example, consideration, unaided awareness, say, and earned media. These things so earned media could be just comments on the brand, online comments, conversational buzz, that kind of thing. Point being is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to marry together two things. One is the long-term, what people do, as in their observed purchase behavior on the one hand, and what people say about the brand on the other. So it'd be a very strange evolving baseline if it was going up and people were saying the brand's awful and the buzz is terrible about it. It would be quite an odd, dichotomy there. So what you're looking for, ideally, is to say, okay, well, the reason the base is growing is as it is because I have a handful of consumer metrics here, brand perception metrics, which I'm going to try and model a pathway through it to say, if I change my unaided awareness by 1%, that leads to, over time, through the dynamics of this system, a 1% change can lead to a new level of unaided awareness. But rather than just having one coefficient which says, okay, if I do this, it moves instantaneously, we're trying to understand how that base grows. So the way I look at it is, if these things are persistent, so these things are kind of persistent measures, you change your brand unaided awareness, more people are aware. You can't really make people unaware, at least not in the short term, as it were. So the point being is that you're saying, okay, if you increase your unaided awareness or your earned media or any of these metrics, and this is not exhaustive, there could be many of these things to look at depending on the data availability. What you're trying to do is first identify a relationship between these things, of why or how base is behaving, some kind of equilibrium relationship. Then you're saying, okay, I'm going to disturb that equilibrium relationship, say by TV. Yeah. And TV could then feed into changing media, could change into feed into changing awareness or consideration, which then feeds into changing base through these identified relationships. But the key is, it then gives us a measure of when these things do change. Yes, the long-term purchase propensity to buy the brand increases, but it does so in a gradual way, because only a certain proportion of people are in the market for your product at the moment, typical 95-5 rule that people talk about. So what you're trying to do is estimate, almost like, as folks come into the market, the permanency of the media, if you like, or the advertising effects. When they're in the market, they're then ready to buy, and more people, and then the full effect, the full long-term base effect wears in. That's really all we're saying. And that's just the way we like to think about how short and long-term effects operate. Okay. Still just a model, not a done deal. It's just to start a conversation to say, okay, this is how we can potentially think about this stuff. Okay. So that's the first start of a 10 that MMM doesn't really deal with satisfactorily. And we're trying to kind of push the envelope a bit on that and say, this is how we should start thinking about it. The second main point, which you could argue is probably even more fundamental, is this thing about causality. And causality just goes back to standard best fit lines. I say this, and I don't want to be too facetious about it, but this is what, if we go back to the standard econometrics textbooks, as I'm sure you guys know, you'll have the 5 assumptions, right? And the assumptions are no autocorrelation, no heterostasticity, no multicollinearity, all that kind of stuff. Those are fine. Multicollinearity is a pain, obviously, but things like autocorrelation can be dealt with, because that's just a case of you may have a bit of omitted variables you need to put in. You may need to put more lags in to deal with the autocorrelated structure of the residuals. Those things you can deal with to a greater or lesser extent. The key problem, or the key assumption in any model, is the so-called exogenous drivers. So I think it's number 4 or 5 of these assumptions, where they say the X variables, like in a physics experiment, are fixed in repeated sampling. So, you don't, so you can literally randomize control in a way. You can dose something and you can observe differences with this famous ceteris paribus phrase that economists talk about, which never happens. I remember talking to a physics mate who I've often seen as the pinnacle in mathematical excellence, say, I don't know how you do economics. It's too hard. Everything's moving. How do you identify and control for anything? And then that is the key problem. So when you're setting up a regression line like this, whether it's sexy unobserved component modeling, whether it's whatever it is, these things are assumed to be exogenous, right? They're not what we call, they're not stochastic. They're not randomly changing, right? They are fixed in repeated sampling. So you can change this, keep everything else fixed, and we know that that coefficient is what we think it is. That's the bottom line. Therefore, if they are all exogenous and fixed, as in there are ceteris paribus, really, you can fix this, knowing what that coefficient is, then it's called a causal link. But because we don't know that, because when you change this or any of these, you don't know whether you're changing just that, because lots of things here could be linked. So there could be lots of unobserved factors in the error term which affects this. So when you change this and you look at that coefficient, it doesn't necessarily relate exactly to changes in P, and similarly here to changes in X. And it's that identification problem which underpins the problem with any econometric model, and in this instance, marketing mix. And the reason I say all that is because if I go back a few slides and I go back to this thing here, and we talk about last click, what I see a lot of is these nested structures where you'd say, okay, sales and search, for example, here, let's say, are co-determined by TV. So I'm going to build a submodel for search in terms of TV, as well as sales in terms of TV. There's this kind of connection. And with that connection, I'm dealing with it. But that's not true, because the idea of nested structures is really just to try and deal with this so-called last touch attribution. I know paid search potentially is driving something, but that's been driven by something else further back in the chain. That's what those nested network models are trying to do. They don't deal with a more fundamental problem of selection bias. And there are many different words and terminologies: selection bias, simultaneity, reverse causality, loads of stuff which needs to be dealt with. And the reason I say that is because if we think about this chain back again here, what we're saying really is we have a variable here which says brand sales is a function of, for example, web traffic. Maybe let's say paid search. Let's say brand sales is a function of web traffic, paid search, and TV and whatever. Yes, you can say, I'm going to run a system like this, which understands how TV drives paid search further back in the chain, but it's the correlation or coefficient, if you like, of paid search on the brand itself in the model, which is biased. So just reallocating a bit of paid search back to TV and fine tuning it a little bit is good, but it's only one source of the problem, which is this thing called selection bias. So just to kind of touch on that a little bit more. So what we're saying is, it's a bit like, the idea is really, if you're trying to understand the effect of years of education on salary, and you just run a model of salaries and years of education plus whatever, plus an error term, and you take the coefficient of years of education and say, that's the benefit of going to university. But hang on, what about the fact that people who are going to go to university are likely to be cleverer, potentially, and therefore earn higher wages? So therefore you've got a problem, because you've got a selection process, variables which drive selection into treatment, which is the education, but also drive sales together, i.e. there's a missing factor of ability. That's what selection bias is all about. And it's those unobserved effects which you can't, or you need to try and control for. It's all very well to sort of focus on regression effects, to focus on what we call selection on observables. So I can observe factors and control for them, confounders and the rest of it. That's fine. The problem is when you have unobserved confounders like this. And that's typically true in things like search. When you think about brand search, when people are more predisposed to buy or predisposed to search and more predisposed to buy. Therefore, there's a common unobserved confounder which you need to deal with. Right? So people like Google Meridian have dealt with that because they have a DAG approach. They wrote a paper on it, which says, okay, we believe that in order to control for that unobserved confounder, we need to incorporate Google search into the model. And when you do that in tandem with paid search, or natural Google search, you can deal with that unobserved confounder and get a handle on the paid search coefficient. So the kind of off-the-shelf solutions like Meridian try and deal with that. I'm not saying it's necessarily right. It's just nodding to the fact that it's an important part of what we do and trying to deal with it, basically. But this whole thing is called an endogeneity or identification problem. Bottom line is, when I run a model, how do I know the coefficient I'm looking at, which is the foundation for all my budget allocation? How do I know it's really what I think it is? No one knows, right? So how do we deal with it? Well, there are basic, and this is not me, this is all out there. There are many, many ways of thinking about how we deal with it. And this really is Nobel Prize winning stuff, right? Because people like Heckman and those guys, they won Nobel Prizes for this sort of stuff, thinking about, right, all I have in front of me here is observational data. I don't have a randomized controlled experiment. Everyone's moving all over the place. How do I really know that my advertising or whatever coefficient it is what I think it is? Well, the first way of thinking about it is people think about most basic one is fixed effects, and that's just a panel model. So it's like saying, you know, if I have observations repeated over time across many different dimensions, um, then I can then, if there are constant over time unobserved factors which are affecting my sales, I can sweep them away with a so-called intercept for every equation, right? I don't want to get too deep into this because we can go on forever, right? There are so many approaches. I'm just trying to kind of put a theme across that there are various econometric approaches which have their benefits but also their assumptions. So fixed effects assumes that unobserved confounders are fixed and constant over time, which may not be the case. Instrumental variables is a right dog's dinner, because basically it has so many assumptions to go through it. Basically, the idea of instrumental variable is you're trying to exogenize something like paid search. So you'd need a model which said, okay, I have a variable which explains my paid search, but doesn't directly affect my sales. So we have an equation that says sales is a function of stuff plus paid search. Paid search, which is my treatment variable, for example, is a function of something else. But that something else has to be independent of my sales equation. Can't be TV, because TV could drive it, but TV could also drive sales. So that's called an exclusion principle. It wouldn't work. Finding those proper instruments are notoriously difficult. My old prof used to say, may as well use telephone numbers because it's so hard to find them. Brilliantly clever idea, very difficult to do in practice. Difference in differences, a bit like geo experiments, is really what people call it these days. You can treat different areas, but has its own problems. One thing is that you're trying to extract a common growth factor from each of these variables, and they have to be the same over time for all of them. So it's a difficult one to do, but can be done. If done well, can work. Regression discontinuity design. Basic idea there is you have two samples. Let's say you want to understand the effect of a test, whereas the only people who got over 90% go to university, and anyone below didn't go, and you want to understand the effect of university. Well, the people who got 89 are going to be more or less the same as the people who got 90. So therefore, you have two groups which are broadly the same, but have different outcomes in their life. Therefore, comparing the two together is going to give you a broad feel for what the actual causal effect of getting over 90% and going to university is. That's what regression discontinuity is about. Things like copulars, propensity scores, Heckman correction, all these things are just ways, typically, that's why I've lumped them together, are ways of trying to run a model for my selection process, whether that's going into university, whether that's going into education as the driver, whether that's I don't know, let's say wages, a wage equation. People who get higher wages. Well, what's the selection process to go into employment? So it's basically a model for the selection process. Because don't forget, the whole problem is there's a correlation between the selection process and the outcome. That's what's screwing everything up. So they try and build a model to say, this is my effect, this is my model for the selection process, which then becomes almost like an additional variable in the regression equation. And they stick that in as a control. So that's what those kind of things tend to reduce to, just controls for these selection bias problems. Then you have things like DAG analysis. How do I really understand the properties of the DAG I'm looking for? So the idea is, go back to that previous one here, right? Go back to these things. This is what we call a DAG, a directed acyclical graph. You could just assume a path through it, but that kind of assumes away the problem. You could say the simultaneity problem is I could rearrange this system. I could say search is a function of traffic is a function of it then drives brand. I could reverse it and say traffic drives this and that drives this. I could change it around. It doesn't change the model, but there are different reasonings as why you do it. And all I mean by that is the simultaneity or the bias problem in things like this can often originate from the fact that different orderings of these networks, different pathways are equally likely. So which one do you choose? Well, you could just say, well, I'm going to estimate the likelihood of one path, estimate the likelihood of another path, and then say, right, what is the likelihood of each of those and weight them so I can then get a feel for what the most likely coefficient on my offending variable is. That's what DAG analysis is kind of about. Yeah. I'm probably ranting on a bit here, forgive me. But so, and then you have this thing called causal AI, which a lot of people talk about. Again, it's not a silver bullet. You can't just run models and automate them and call it a causal AI. And there are two elements to this. First is just enhanced machine learning. So if you think about, you've probably heard of things like double machine learning. Double machine learning is just a way of it's a model which sets up a model for the, like we said before, for the selection process. But really, what it's doing, and this is where the machine learning comes from, it's really trying to deal with the bias from what people call regularization. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but roughly speaking, this is where I think data scientists and econometricians differ, because data scientists talk a lot about regularization. All that means is I have one variable, I have 1,000 drivers, they're all correlated, they're all collinear. How do I sift and understand the relationships? How do I can reduce them? That's kind of called regularization, and it spawns a lot of stuff. Anyway, doing that can then introduce bias. So double machine learning is really about trying to reduce the bias in these kind of regularization and simplification techniques. But crucially, all the conditions for identification, i.e., there are no hidden confounders. They have this thing called positivity, which just means that every single person exposed has a result. Lots of these things called identification conditions, they're all assumed to hold. So it doesn't really deal with the issue, really, which is how do we deal with these things? If they're assumed to hold, you're not really dealing with it. You're kind of sidestepping it. Similarly, how do you identify causal DAG structures? So how can we take a data as an observational data set and say, right, this is the true causal chain threat? Well, there's been many books and stuff written about these do not work. But more importantly, like we just said a minute ago, there's not just one causal chain. There could be three or four that are equally likely. So how do you deal with that? So the bottom line I'm trying to get at really in all this is that human judgment assumptions are always required in this stuff. You can't just whack it into a system and say, right, there's my answer. Right. There's a lot of judgment required. So finally, to finish off, forgive me, I'll do just one more slide on where we're kind of going these days and what we hear about now, which is these solutions called experimental solutions. So we've probably all heard of it. So you've heard of things probably like, calibration of MMM. We've heard of things like, quasi experiments are things like geolift tests. There's a lot of that about where we just simply, we kind of, like I say here, we have 100 DMAs, we treat certain markets, but we do so in such a way we group them in such a way that the controls and the tests are similar. What does that mean, similar? Well, that's another matter, but that's the key. You need to make sure these things have similar. It's like store matching that Nielsen used to do. You look at similar trend patterns, similar sales patterns, and kind of think they're similar, and then you can then see them as test and control, and then treat one, and then see the difference as the treatment effect. And that's a little bit like that difference in differences we talked about earlier on. But the key is there's no randomization. You're not randomly selecting consumers. What you're saying is marketing is withheld to ostensibly identical test and control groups. A/B testing. So you're randomly allocating media like Meta would do. You're randomly allocating, I don't know, testing a new website design. You're randomly allocating to different consumers. But how do you know the consumers aren't randomized? So how do you know the consumers are similar? How do you know you're not serving to people who would have been more likely to buy anyway? So there are problems with A/B testing. It's not a done deal. Randomized controlled trials, people call the gold standard, but there's been many papers written on that. It's not assumption free. It's not necessarily gold standard. It still has its assumptions. But the key is to remove the selection bias effect. And that's predominantly what it's about. We've heard many of these things in health trials and the different arms of a health trial to try and understand if I'm allocating randomly and to randomized groups, how do I remove the selection bias effect, if you like, and harmonize these groups so they're ostensibly, comparable. But this is where the interesting bit comes in, is we've all heard of Bayesian, presumably. I think I look at that as, well, there's been many buzzwords in marketing. First it was big data, whatever that means, and then it was Bayesian, which everyone went weak at the knees at for about 5 years, and now it's incrementality, and calibration. And what I mean by that is, and it all comes back to this thing called identification. You run a model. I don't believe what the observational data point is telling me. So I'm going to ignore it potentially, or at least relegate its importance. And I'm going to do a randomized controlled trial or any of these as best I can. And then I'm going to take those estimated incrementals, if you want to call it that, and I'm going to substitute those into my mixed model. And that's my answer. And that's what underpins this whole current incrementality revolution that we hear about on LinkedIn and other forums, where people talk about it, but what they really mean is identification, because it all comes down to that. Does it mean what we think it means? And because we have this thing called a randomized controlled trial, where I know what I've controlled, back to our bench physics experiment, I've controlled this, kept it fixed. These are changing, everything. So I know it's coming from that. I've identified it. That's when you can then say it's incremental. However, all lovely in theory, but of course, we need them for every variable. We need them for search. What about TV? TV is less prone to it, but it's still, everything's endogenous and you need to draw a line somewhere, right? And of course, when you do a project and you say to the clients, okay, can I have all your RCT results, please? And they'll look at you blankly and say, what are you talking about? Typically, some of them do. We've been working with clients recently who have them. For some of them, but generally speaking, it's not available. So then you just have to take recourse to everything we talked about. All these approaches. These are approaches to do with observational data, because that's all you have recourse to, typically. So in summary, bit of a whistle-stop tour, forgive me, but in summary, I think there are three things to take away from this. MMM structures have evolved to capture increasing complexity. So with things like TikTok and Instagram and all these online social platforms coming through, how do we incorporate those into the mix, right? These are just aggregated dialectic or cyclical graphical versions of more granular multi-touch approaches. And they're intended to capture the full off-online mix. And the key meat of that is marginal return on investment, budget allocation, but with just nodding to the fact that things like sales decompositions and absolute ROI, they're not a done deal. People who go around saying, that's the goal, we know that. Well, do you? Right? Because I could change my reference points in the model and I get a different answer. Now, particularly with things like log-log models, reference points are critical. So I'm not going to get too detailed to that, but certainly chat future points about that. But the main point is it's a judgment. A lot of it is judgment. And of course, same thing for response curves, right? As you talked about before. But those are the kind of small issues really in the grand scheme of things. It's just kind of nodding to the fact that even standard modeling practices are not a done deal. So the key issues are capturing meaningful brand building. You've got to be very careful about what ad stocks mean, about what you want to use them for, and how to deal with understanding or deal with estimating how base grows and what's driving it, and requires a fundamental restructure of the mixed model. And then finally, unless identified, model parameters are just correlations or a combination of cause and correlation. And you don't know, and that's the key point behind identification. If I have a parameter, how do I know which element is causal, genuinely causal, and which part is just, meaningless correlation? That's the key. And the bottom line in all that is endogeneity bias is unobservable. And that's the point I'd like to finish on, which is when you run a model, underpinning all of this causal stuff, in any textbook you see, it will say the same thing, which is endogeneity as opposed to exogeneity, where you have a fixed and your typical physics benchmark experiment. Endogeneity is just telling you that your variable in your model is correlated with your error term. So there are things which move the error term, will therefore move your variable in question, and you don't know what's going on. You can't isolate it. And that link between the variable and the error term is inherently unobservable because that's a property of the model. Don't forget, when we do this, we have a model which says sales as a function to stuff plus an error term, and then we run the model, we have sales as a function of stuff plus a residual. The residual in any econometric model is just an estimate of the error. It's not the same thing. And endogeneity stems from relationship between price or TV or whatever it is and the error, which is unobservable. So just by going into your model and saying, right, I'm now going to look at the correlation between my between my TV and my estimated residual, that will always be zero by construction. So it's point you can't do that. So that's what I mean by that inherent endogeneity problem, which is correlation between the error and the variable is inherently unobservable. There are ways of trying to deal with that, but it's very difficult. And that's the problem. So controlling for observed compounders, which is typically what regression likes to do, chuck a bunch of stuff in and control for stuff like weather or whatever, typically insufficient. Good, problematic in other areas because you don't want to condition on colliders. You can see a lot of that online. People talk about that. But the main problem is unobserved confounders, which lies at the heart of things like selection bias, simultaneity bias, reserve causality. And that's it.
All right, Peter, we have quite a few questions here, and we're going to have to move through them pretty quickly given our time envelope. So I'll just roll right into it. Jonathan Knowles asks, love the focus on what affects baseline, not just incremental sales. Does
Mhm.
this mindset mirror the financial distinction between earnings, short-term model, and earnings multiple, long-term model?
You mean like a CLV type thing?
I
Like a,
believe so, and we've done in MASB, we've done a lot of CLV work where, where that is the logic behind it, which is a multiple on the short term.
yeah, it's trying to do that. It's analogous, yes. But I think but you've hit a good point about the multiple. That's something I didn't mention, which is so the answer to the question is yes, it's analogous to that, and they're trying to get an alternative way to look at a CLV. But the word multiple is key because don't forget, a lot of people, because people have looked to this multiple of short and long in academic publications, which say long term is twice the short, people then go ahead and multiply their answers by two, which is inherently wrong. And the reason it's inherently wrong, and I'm happy to talk about this, whoever wants to listen, is those two times, three times multipliers are based on those ad stock type models. If you go back to the academic publications, so simply by multiplying your model, which will already have an ad stock in it by definition, multiplying that by three is just double counting. You need to get into understanding how these things drive the baseline to understand genuine brand building capability of media.
Okay. Alejandra Rugla Vargas asks, can you please briefly discuss pre-processing techniques and exploratory data analysis one should implement when building these models?
Well, that's why I think the AI can help. So I think that's so it's useful to delineate between where and when AI can help. AI can't really help in understanding identification, but it can certainly help in pre-processing data. So things like how do I so social platforms, right? So how do I understand what the best metric is to represent media on a social platform? How do I understand, how do I incorporate quality of a media variable? Like we used to do at Mill Brown, right? You have pre-testing to say, well, this is a better quality than that. How do I incorporate that? So understanding all that is important. Pre-processing is also important for things like response curves. So things like this, all this sort of stuff here. These are all pre-processed, right? They're not the raw data. You have to take the raw data and you have to apply transforms to it. That's all about pre-processing. Okay. Is that the kind of thing you're after?
I think it's on target for him because for Alejandra, because at a high level, how would we incorporate the results of A/B testing into the model? So I think it is in alignment.
You can do that. Yeah. So a good point. So let's say you have an experimental result. Typically, one can do that by saying, okay, the A/B result, A/B test result, experimental result, whatever it is. There are lots of highfalutin ways to do this. I think a very simple way is to say, I don't believe the regression result. I believe and a lot of clients do this, I believe my experimental result. So I'm going to take the implied volume incremental from that experimental result, X number of units uplift for a certain unit uplift in TV, whatever, or whatever it is. And I'm going to put that in the model by saying, what coefficient does my TV need to be to deliver the same uplift that I'm being told is coming from the experimental result? And that's how I would then guide the model to say, this is how I would incorporate that result by changing the coefficient so it matches in my decomposition process. It's a very simple way of doing it, but that's one way.
Mhm. Great. Another one we have from Jim Meyer. He asks if you have a view, even if speculative, on what percentage of large companies do MMM very well, and does it differ between B2C and B2B?
No idea. That's the simple answer to that one. Uh,
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's difficult for me to say. I mean, I've seen most MMM solutions across most. Yeah, I mean, as I say, these things here are standard now. This type of structure, I would say, is standard across most across most. So that's doing it well. The problem comes again, I guess, to how any marketing mix solution needs to come with some kind of identification scheme, particularly on things like paid search, where we have a lot of online, selection bias, blah, blah, blah. I don't know to what extent that is being dealt with, and I certainly don't know to what extent this is being dealt with. What I do know is that there's at least two companies who've now adopted this approach, which is good to see. I've been publishing on this, so it's nice. It's almost like a nice rubber stamp where people are starting to do this. And maybe there's some mileage in it, right? And again, this is what it's for. It's to say, here's a way of thinking about this stuff. What do you think? And can we improve on it? Rather than just settling on the dual ad stock, yeah, it's all done. It's not done. Long term is really difficult to do, and in some sense unobservable, because this is just an estimate, because you're trying to forecast what the effect is into the future,
Yeah.
and
Yes, and Eric actually asked a question which is very, I think, a secondary part to that. If I'm a smaller size CPG company with an upcoming standard Nielsen type MMA planned, how do I apply this learning in the next couple of weeks of collecting data?
which learning, the long term learning,
Yeah, I think generally the model approach that you provided.
this one here.
Yes, I
Um,
believe so.
yeah, okay, well, let me try and play that back. So it's quite scalable, this stuff, right? So you can estimate these things relatively quickly. Dealing with identification is hard, but let's just imagine we're dealing with a basic regression structure. You can build these very quickly, and this will depend on whether you have, this type of indirect customer perception data or not. But it's if you only have 2 weeks to implement, I mean, are you saying that you only have 2 weeks to do the entire model, or you have 2 weeks of extra data, for example, just to kind
I
of
think
clarify?
he's referring mostly to the collecting data piece to ensure that he would have the data available, is what I'm reading into the question.
Um, Sorry, forgive me. So you're saying, how do we go about collecting the data, or just
Yeah,
replay the question again, Frank?
yes.
Sorry.
How do I apply this learning in the next couple of weeks of collecting data?
Um, Not sure I answered the question really.
If it's okay, maybe we'll follow up afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think I need a bit more context around that
We'll
question. Uh,
we'll hook you two up.
yeah, sure.
Okay, and then I think we have time for one more, which is we'll ask for Joanna Seddon. MASB has initiatives around MMM and around brand valuation, but we've never linked the two. Any ideas on how to do it?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, all this is part and parcel of, I guess, brand valuation in the sense that, you know, the idea of marketing growing underlying base and the loyal stock of consumers, if there is such a thing. I mean, Byron Sharp would probably take issue with that. Is the way I like to think about it. So the brand valuation piece is something that I think, I mean, Joanna and I should talk about this quite a bit. This is linking to brand valuation because, you know, if a brand is a higher value, you would have argued it's got a bigger slice of the pie. Therefore, how does media grow the base and therefore grow the value of the brand? I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this, which I think is different from how you actually create the brand valuation index itself, as in what are the facets that go into understanding the brand value, the brand Z indexes that are created. I think to me that's another matter. For me, I would just draw the parallel by saying, higher base growth, stronger brand, higher brand valuation. How does media drive that trajectory?
Yes, and
Two.
right now, a lot of our work in our ISO committees and also in the MASB standards portion really comes down to having confidence in future cash flows.
Mhm.
Most of the models, brand valuation techniques, their analytic models are based upon discounting future cash flows to the current, and they want to have confidence in that. So it sounds like these might be the next generation of providing that type of confidence.
Yeah, but you raise a good point, Frank, because basically, in trying to understand or quantify these trajectories, you have to make some assumptions. So, for example, what you're really saying is you do some TV today, you do some really good brand building TV today, or over the sample, 3 years or whatever, right? And then you're trying to say, right, all this right hand side is about I've carved off the short term call to action, knee jerk, for want of a better expression, stuff with a bit of ad stock in it. But I've tried to quantify the extent to which that TV has lifted my baseline by a certain percentage. Okay. So then you're saying, okay, well, conceptually, that's kind of persistent. Don't forget, when we do a 99% ad stock, which is what you see in many publications about long term, so long and short of it does this, right? Um, they're essentially using a 99% ad stock. Well, here, it's like 100% because it's persistent, but it's never really going to be persistent. So you may put a bit of decay on it.
Hmm.
So, okay, into the future, it may decay, not only because people forget or leave the category over time, or there's a discount factor associated to it. Because obviously, if you want to discount that back to today, you need to to say, well, how likely are these revenue streams to materialize? So you have a certain discount factor, whether that's 10% a year or whatever it is. And therefore, the modeling itself delivers the base uplift. How that spreads over into time, into the future, can only be a little bit touchy feely with a confidence around it. But there has to be, because you're projecting into the future and no one knows. So it's still just a model in that sense.
Great. Well, Peter, I think that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for bringing this forward. I think this is a glimpse into the type of modeling that we're going to see evolving over time. So it would be fun to watch it develop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's great. It's good to see.
All right, and thank you to all of our attendees for participating. If the questions which we didn't have a chance to ask Peter directly on our stream, we'll provide to him and along with contact information, and maybe we can have offline conversations.
Perfect. Excellent.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you.
Take care.